Okay, so the reason we kind of decided to put this on is because it is actually the anniversary of the Spanish Civil War and Revolution, so why not have a talk about it? The first question I had while trying to put this presentation is, how do you actually speak about history? What do you focus on? What do you omit? Whatever decisions, these very small decisions add up to maybe completely changing the narratives. So I don't want to missell this. There are certain things that I have omitted from this just because of time and just because it's very difficult to speak about a 3-year period of civil war and revolution without making any omissions. So I thought I'd be the most forthright with what it is I'm omitting. What I'm omitting is the side of Franco's and the rebels. I'm focusing on, through this presentation, on the actual revolution itself and on the CNT, the Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, which was the main kind of force within the revolution. I also won't be speaking about the PUM, which is an independent Marxist organization, mostly in Catalonia, which has a very important role to play in the revolution and was one of the groups that was suppressed by the communists throughout the revolution. I also won't be speaking too much about the Socialist Party, which was in government during most of the Civil War and the Revolution, or the associated trade union, the UGT. These are a lot of big omissions, but without making these, we'd be here for days. The second thing is, how do I structure this presentation? I didn't want this to be a very dry, historic, where I just give you a bunch of dates and throw a lot of information on, even though I will be doing both of those things. But I thought I'd organize it against broader themes that we could discuss together as takeaways. So this is not just a case study, but something that we can draw out lessons for today from. These themes are focused around these 4 questions. Can you make a revolution? Are revolutions something that happen, or are they something that you actually actively create or shape? What do revolutions and civil wars have in common? The title of this presentation has both civil war and revolution in it. How do they interact with each other? How do you deal with a situation of multiple sovereignty? And I'll define this term clearer later on. And what role does the international situation play when it comes to revolutions, and how all of these different things intersect? So before I dive in here, are there any just general questions? Anything you'd like to start with at the top?
Just question, when you're saying you're looking at the CNT, is that specifically the CNT or the relationship, including the relationship between the CNT and the FAL?
Yes, so I actually do not talk too much about the FAI, but throughout the Civil War, they were essentially non-distinguishable. So even on posters, and you'll see it, both names almost appeared together. And it was only until really the end of the Civil War, the end of the Revolution, that you started having a divergence again after the May Days, which I will be discussing. But that is a good question.
Silly question. What does FAI stand for?
The FAI is it's the Anarchist Federation of Iberia, the Iberian Anarchist Federation in English, and Spanish. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but yeah.
Thank you.
And they were a group of CNT members. Their mission was to make sure the CNT kept true to its revolutionary mission. So kind of a internal, external opposition role of CNT members. Right, so our first theme is, can you make a revolution? And before talking about the revolution itself, we need to contextualize it based on what was happening in Spain for a revolution to develop. The most major development here is the transition of Spain from a monarchy to a republic, or what was known as the Second Republic there, between the years of 1930 and 1931. Before that, Spain was under the dictatorship of General Miguel Primo de Rivera, and he was kicked out of the country by the king for poor economic performance, and soon enough the king was kicked out of the country as well for, well, just being a king. In 1931, there were municipal elections, and these were largely taken as a referendum on the future of Spain. Should Spain stay as a monarchy, or should it transition to a republic? There was a landslide victory for Republicans. The king goes into exiles, and a secular republic was established. Now, this was a big blow for the traditional forces in Spain. And when we talk about the traditional forces, there are really three parts of that we need to think of. The first is the clergy and the church. The second is the military. The third is the large landowners. And all three of these sections of society lost a lot of their privileges. For the clergy, they lost state subsidies for their salaries. They were also no longer allowed to teach in education institutions. For large landowners, they feared a promised land reform law, which was promised which was on the agenda of the Republicans, and the army was no longer allowed to make statements on civilian matters, and they were removed from any judicial duties that they later that they had before that. So really it is a big separation from the state and the church, as well as the state from the army, and the army becoming an extension of the state itself without the ability to influence the state. So all of these really put these sections of society on edge, and they would come together to form political alliances throughout this period, 1931 to 1936, in opposition of the Republic. And this is the flag of the Second Republic. It would look familiar if you've seen the flag of the International Brigades, which I'll also briefly discuss later on. So that's kind of the conservative side of the formula, but there was another side of the formula, the CNT itself. The CNT is some people refer to it as an anarcho-syndicalist union, some people refer to it as an anarchist union. I think the easiest way to think of them is just as a revolutionary industrial union. The CNT itself was founded in 1910. It has the goal of absolute moral, economic, and political liberation of mankind, which will be achieved once the land, means of production, and exchange have been socialized and the overweening power of the state has vanished. So this is the last part is very important. What makes them more anarchist is this idea that they are against the state in whatever format it appeals in. There are three key principles to understand how the CNT work. The first is federalism, is really at the core of their, of not only what they believe the future society should look like, but how they currently function, or how they used to function at that time. At the basis of their organization is the Sindicato Unicos, or the Unitary Syndicates. These are very similar to the way the IWW organizes today. They would organize all workers within a workplace together, regardless of their trade. So if you had a cleaner and a teacher, let's say in a school, they would still be in the same union together to maximize leverage against the bosses. These workplace unions would then federate into local confederations and then regional confederations. And there was also an elected national committee by the entire membership. Now, although there was a national committee, no single part of the union was actually subject to the rulings of the national committee. So there was complete autonomy within all levels of the union, which would bring them into some trouble later on. Another important thing is their understanding of insurrectionary revolution. The CNT saw revolution as what they called a violent act that would be enabled by the culmination of psychological, social, and organizational development. So for them, revolution is, and I quote here, merely the phenomenon which effectively clears the way for a state of affairs which has slowly taken shape in the collective consciousness. So a revolution is not really a process for them. You have a process before the revolution, but revolution itself is a violent event where you have this switch in economic and social affairs. This is important because it will come into play later on. But their understanding of revolution meant that the role of the union was not to dictate when the time of revolution is come to pass, when there is a readiness or when the class consciousness has developed in a way enough that you can now have a revolution, but rather just to increase the antagonisms within society, so that whenever any worker, due to this autonomy, this federalist principles, decide now is the time, they have the tools and the know-how to carry out a revolution. So, you have the conservatives of one side, don't like the idea for a republic. The CNT on another side also don't like the idea for a republic for two very different reasons. One wants to bring about libertarian socialism, the other wants to restore the privileges that they have lost with the coming of the republic. And this, of course, created a great deal of tension as the republic itself was also trying to constitute itself as a new republic. So this history between 1931 and 1936 is littered with many examples of class conflict, failed insurrections, general strikes. So I only wanted to summarize some of the things that went on in that time to try and drive really the intensity of this period and what was happening. So in August 1932, the year after the Republic sets up its new constitution, there is a failed coup attempt in response to a toothless agrarian reform. The Republic was successful in passing an agrarian reform, but it really had no means of implementing it. The police section that is usually in the rural areas of Spain is usually in the pockets of the landowners, so there was no really force behind this agrarian reform law. But there were also structural factors because the land was heavily indebted and there was a kind of symbiotic relationship between the banks and the landowners. Any kind of reform law that went too far would put the entire financial system in Spain under kind of pressure to crack. So it couldn't have been anything but a toothless reform as long as you were operating within kind of a capitalist logic. In January 1933, there was a failed insurrection led by the CNT. This was meant to be a national insurrection, but it really, the harshest fighting was in a town called Casas Vejas. Over there, the leader of the CNT's house was surrounded and set on fire with his family still in it, and anyone trying to flee was immediately shot by the so-called Republican government. This was an event that was highly captured in print media at the time, in newspapers, so it led to the collapse of the first government. There was then early elections in November 1933, and the Conservatives came to power. The CNT led a massive boycott campaign to the elections, and this is part of their understanding of direct action. They reject any sort of mediation, and they see the state as the largest mediator, and therefore they have a somewhat consistent approach when it comes to boycotting elections and abstaining from elections. But the 2 years in the Conservative government was in power is called as the Bienio Negro, or the two black years. And this is because essentially the first thing the government did was to roll back any of the gains that the Republic has initiated in the first 2 years, including the agrarian reform law, including the charters of autonomy that were extended for Catalonia and the Basque Country. Now, although during those elections, the CEDA, which was the right-wing political party, gained the majority of seats, they weren't allowed ministerial positions until August 1934. And since they were let into the government, The Socialist Party and the CNT took this as a view that Spain is heading in a fascist direction. This is a year, remember, following the rise of fascist Germany. So a general strike was called, and there was a big uprising in the Asturian regions, which is a mining region in the north of Spain. There, the CNT, as well as other parties, took control of 80% of the region, including the factories. They started running them as collectives and started producing their own weapons in armored trucks and so forth. So it was a bit of a preview of what would happen during the Civil War and the Revolution. It's furthermore a preview because it was General Franco who was then sent to crush the rebellion there successfully. So 1934 is very much taken as the, if you will, the dress rehearsal of what were to come 2 years later. In February 36, there was again new general elections following corruption scandals, and you had the emergence of the Popular Front. They won the elections by a slim minority, but this is really what triggered the events, the coup in 1936. I'll take a quick pause here to see how people are doing. Questions? No? Good. All right. There's a lot of dates. So yeah, here's the ultimate question. Do revolutions happen or are they made? We see that the period of the Second Republic was characterized by political and economic crises. Was it inevitable that these would lead to revolution or civil war? Usually we have this understanding of revolution that crises are something that happen and they're outside of our agency. But if we go back to all of these dates, a lot of these became crises because of the way the working class and the CNT specifically reacted to them. Had the CNT not reacted to them in these specific ways, capitalism would have continued to function the way it would have wanted to. There is no crisis until there is a reaction to it. And I like to bring up, we hear crisis a lot in the news today. We talk about the cost of living crisis. And it is a crisis because it is affecting people's livelihoods, right? People are having to pay between eating or paying heat or anything like that. But capitalism doesn't really care about that. It's, capitalism has never cared about people dying for it to continue to be able to regenerate itself or recreate itself, or reproduce itself is probably the best word here. It is only when the working class actually has a response that it can push something to what I would call a crisis. It is only when there are mobilizations, they don't need to be as intense as armed insurrections as the CNT did, that we can talk about a crisis leading to some kind of revolutionary process or the opening of a revolutionary process. And we see at each of these dates, the CNT took a stance that would further deepen a crisis and really make it a confrontation between the forces of capital and the working class itself. So yeah, I think I've covered everything there. Okay, so let's get into the juicy stuff now that we've talked about the background to all of this. And the theme of this part is, what do revolutions and civil wars have in common? There is a lot of linguistic debate. Do we talk about what happened in Spain as a civil war, a revolution, a bit of both? And I'll draw on examples of other revolutions to talk about this. So the revolution and the civil war started with a coup attempt led by General Francisco Franco on the 17th of July 1936. The launching base of this coup was the north of Morocco, which was then a part of Spanish colonies, and the Canary Islands. So that's where the first mobilizations were. And it lasted until the 21st of July, where various garrisons in Spain either participated in the coup, so tried to participate within it, or stayed on the side. Now, even though the coup is kind of displayed as a large-scale event, and it was, but it's worth noting that the majority of the army, the majority of the garrisons, actually did not join the rebellion. They remained loyal to the Republic, including 50% of the Civil Guard and 70% of the Assault Guard. But what the coup did create was a massive sense of confusion within the state. The first 2 days of the coup, the state was completely in denial that a coup was even happening. It was only once both members of the CNT and the Socialist Party started storming barracks themselves and taking arms for themselves that the state leaped into action and started to react to the coup. By the end of the failed coup attempt, the 21st of July, this is kind of the map or the distribution of territory within Spain. The darker shaded areas are the areas that were under control of Franco, and the white areas are the ones that remained under the control of the Republic. So you can see that Spain was kind of split into 4 sections. The very northern part still under the Republic, then you have kind of the eastern part also under the Republic, and then a middle section and a bottom section under Franco's control. So this left a...
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
You say a coup.
Yes.
And how did it manifest itself? By the season or the state apparatus in those areas?
So it was the military, essentially. Yeah. So it was an alliance between the military and the Falange Party, the fascist party of Spain, as well as I forget their name, the monarchists, the Carlists that wanted to see the restoration of the monarchy. So there was a military section of it, and there was a civilian attachment towards it, which the military thought was necessary for its success, as opposed to the earlier one in 1932 that did not have any civilian backing and was considered as one of the reasons why it failed. So it was pretty much through the barracks within the different regions of Spain. And that's where the mobilization happened. It was an army mobilization.
But there was resistance in these areas?
Yes, there was resistance, and there were massacres recorded. There were garrisons where the general refused to join and they were executed. So yes, there was large-scale resistance, but it is worth noting that that resistance mostly came from workers, from unions themselves, and not the Republic, which was trying to maintain any sense of control. So as you can see by this map, the Republic, by the end of those first few days, still held control over 60% of the population, which was key for conscription later on. They still controlled the main commercial cities and almost the entirety of Spain's industrial bases, which is mostly in Catalonia and the mining centers in the north. However, many soldiers and members, because the state was completely caught off guard by this, and its apparatus was falling apart, at least its coercive apparatus, its military, many soldiers and members of the Civil Guard joined Union militia columns. And these militias had no kind of official ranks, no form of martial discipline. Decisions were made in assemblies where the behavior of officers, conditions, and strategy was discussed. So this is one of the first kind of radical changes that happened through the Civil War and Revolution, was the emergence of the Union militias. But that wasn't the only big change. By the end of those first few days, it was the CNT that emerged as the dominant force in post-coup Spain, because they already had anti-fascist organizing that had emerged in the years before, and they were one of the first ones to storm the kind of barricades, storm the barracks, and redistribute weapons amongst themselves. So there was also a fundamental and radical transformation that is usually overlooked within the entire Republican-controlled areas. So to give you some statistics that show how large this transformation was, workers took over 1/3 of all rural land in Republican Spain, and although 1/3 doesn't seem like a lot, this third represents 2/3 of cultivatable land, so actually productive land. Workers took over and began self-managing 80% of firms in Catalonia, 60% in the Levant, and 30% in Madrid. And these aren't just the cities, but the regions around Spain. And this spanned from all sorts of factories, including heavy industry, textiles and wares, utilities, transport, and commercial functions, including international import and export. So within those few handful of days, all of these fell under workers' self-management. With the collapse of, or the near collapse of the state, workers started organizing themselves into revolutionary committees in factories, neighborhoods, and rural communities. And these communities practiced legislative and executive powers while also carrying out forms of popular justice. So anyone who was seen as a sympathizer with the rebellion or a business organizer was either shot, thrown into jail, or denied the opportunity to speak or vote in these public assemblies. So there was a kind of almost complete transfer of power from the state to workers on regional and local levels. There is overwhelming evidence that the collectives were largely successful across the period. And the transformation was not just that they were now run by the workers, but also the way they were run. So for example, the rural collectives, money was mostly replaced by ration cards based on family size, allowing workers to freely access foodstuff. In urban collectives, there was a bit more resistance to this system, mostly because collectives were run not just by the CNT, but also contained members of other unions that were not perhaps as radical. So in urban collectives, there was a system of a producer's card, where measures of output would allow you to access certain supplies. And in some collectives, salaries and the money system were maintained due to this opposition, but all around benefits and the level of the salary was increased as well. So it's not that there wasn't any change there. Very quickly, there became a system of trade and barter between these collectives in neighboring cities, and soon it was very quick to emerge local, provincial, and regional federations between these collectives. In addition, new mines were opened to supply factories with raw material, especially coal, and factories were rapidly transformed to produce arms and war equipment, an industry that was nearly not to be found in Spain before the revolution. In addition to the normal economic statistics you would take for collectives, like their ability to increase output and productivity, there was also a boost in morale, as all of these collectives had a focus on education and health, and they converted many churches into schools or hospitals. So there was just a general increase in the well-being of people within these collectives. Right, so on to our question is, well, what is the relationship between revolutions, civil wars, and coup? A lot of times they're taken as distinct events that happen. Either we need to look at them as very different things, but as is the case here, we have a coup, a failed coup happening, a revolution happening at the same time, and then with the lines being drawn, the territorial lines on this map, you're setting into a situation of civil war, where you have what I would call multiple sovereignty. And the idea of multiple sovereignty is you have competing centers of power emerging with exclusive claims over either territory or resources. So Franco saw that he had rightful claim to the entirety of Spain. The Republic saw that it had rightful claim to the entirety of Spain. And you had the workers saying, well, wait a second, Spain, as we knew it, doesn't exist anymore. What now exists is the collectives and workers' self-management. So this is the best way to explain this concept of multiple sovereignty. So kind of multiple centers or lack of centers of control still making claim over the same territory or same resources. And just to show that this overlap is not unique to the Spanish Civil War, we see the example of the Russian Revolution in 1917. A lot of historians treat it as the revolution happening in October as one thing, and then the Civil War happening a few years later as distinct or different from the revolution, while as it was actually a struggle to get rid of multiple sovereignty and to regain kind of territorial sovereignty, if you want to call it, or political sovereignty over a geographic area. We can also see it in the Cuban Revolution, which for a period split the country in half as well before the guerrillas reached Havana and could claim that the revolution was complete. So in the opposite fashion to the Russian Revolution, where first there was the capture of the state and then a civil war, and Cuba reverses that situation, where there was first a civil war and then the capture of state power. And you see it in many other examples, such as the revolution in China, in Vietnam, and more recently in Syria. So really, these are overlapping phenomena, and they are not things that should be treated as distinct. What they both share is that they have this concept of multiple sovereignty within them. Okay, so where did we leave things off? Spain is now divided into this kind of triple standoff. You've got the fascist Spain, or the fascists who want to take control over the rest of Spain. You have the Republic that has kind of fallen into pieces and is trying to figure out if it's still relevant at all. And then you have the workers that have started engaging in self-management of the land, of the factories, and have kind of taken the usual function of the state into their own hands. So the question every revolutionary poses to themselves is, well, how do you deal with the situation of multiple sovereignty? And here you have a very interesting paradox when it comes to the CNT. The CNT that has spent the last, 5 years fighting against the state, launching these insurrections, in July 1936 decides, you know what, it sounds like a good idea to join the government. So in July, they first joined the Catalan government, which had gained some measures of autonomy under the Republic. And in September 1936, they fought to gain 4 ministerial positions within the national government in Madrid. Now, historians have pointed that these decisions were made as a clear trespass against their federalist procedure, because absolutely not a single member of the CNT ever voted whether or not the union should join the government. The decision was taken by union militants, many of them who didn't hold any official positions, to make these decisions. So why did this happen? Bernat Bolton, who was a reporter in Spain during the revolution and the Civil War, gives us 4 kinds of reasons as to why this happened. The first is that he claims the anarchists wanted to make sure that they weren't dislodged from the revolution. That if they didn't join the government, they thought, well, then the government is going to do its own thing, it's going to sideline us, and we're going to lose out the revolutionary gains that we've already made. A second reason he provides is that they wanted to preserve the appearance that a legal government was in control, and that this was identified as critical to secure arms from abroad, especially from Britain and France. So Britain and France and other capitalist countries were not going to want to deal with another anarchist entity in Europe. So they said, well, we'll join the government to make everything look nice and polished, and then they'll sell us some guns. 3, to give legal validity to the gains of the CNT, including the establishment of the collectives. And the 4th is to avoid declaring the government moot and installing in its place what a member of the CNT called an anarchist dictatorship. Right? The reality of the war was that the CNT found itself fighting shoulder to shoulder with other socialists, with other Republicans, against a common enemy, the fascists. if they were to abandon this arrangement and carry out the revolution, they would have to essentially force it on people who were effectively their allies, and they saw this as the imposition of an anarchist dictatorship. Now, I believe this is the most important reason, because the other three only follow and only make sense once the CNT turned its back on the idea of carrying out the revolution to its logical conclusion. It's only then that does it make sense to join the government and ensure all of these three other points. But again, so why did how did the CNT, after all of these years of agitating against the state, of launching insurrections, and of holding the federalist principles really key to the way it functions, how did it just turn all its back on all of this? Stuart Christie, a noted anarchist, also a writer who wrote the history of the FAI, kind of the CNT's sister organization, has a very good account of how decision-making power shifted from the rank-and-file members to regional committees that were now staffed by active militants. And eventually, throughout the war, the regional bodies themselves became largely cosmetic, the role reduced to ratifying recommendations put forward by the National Committee. So a large federalist organization suddenly became essentially a democratic centralist organization with a lot less democracy than you probably would have in a democratic centralist. Now, unfortunately, in his analysis, he argues that this is due to opportunism, that because of the militants in the CNT, once the revolution happened, saw that, wait a second, we're suddenly not needed anymore because the workers are doing everything, took the opportunity to join the government so that they remain relevant. I don't find that a very convincing argument. It's very hard to say the likes of Durruti, who then would go on to die fighting in the Civil War, suddenly gave up on all anarchist principles and became an opportunist in this moment. I rather think that it is a result of a weakness in their revolutionary theory. The revolutionary theory that we discussed before, the insurrectionary conception of revolution, does not account for the idea, the situation of multiple sovereignty to arise, or what was called in the Russian Revolution dual power. And due to the theoretical weakness of this, once the CNT found itself in this situation, the only conclusion they could draw was that the objective conditions for social revolution was not ripe, and therefore joined the government itself. Of course, it is not only about revolutionary theory, but how the CNT itself progressed. In the last few years of the Republic, before the failed coup attempt, the CNT had experienced increased cooperation with other unions and militant workers through either insurrectionary attempts or through their encouragement of voting for the Popular Front coalition, which had promised the release of political prisoners, most of which were CNT members imprisoned during the Bienio Negro. So this is a very sudden shift within the CNT, but what were the consequences of these actions? Well, since they joined the government, they had a minority position, and they were left with little power to actually influence decision-making. Even though they were given 4 ministerial positions, it was only 3 people who occupied those ministerial positions, so 1 person occupied 2 ministerial positions, and they were largely not important ministerial positions under conditions of war. So this left them highly underrepresented, even though on the ground they were the ones leading the collectives and they were the ones in a material advantage, in a material position of power. The CNT would continue to support the central government and its plans until the very end of the war, going as far as looking at the promotion of these plans, which were horrible and led to the loss of the Civil War, as its own. So they were promoting them as equally revolutionary as the CNT's own ideas, when they very clearly were not. So here are some dates to show how the rollback of the revolution and the gains of the CNT started taking place. In October 1936, so just a few months after the failed coup attempt, there was the beginning of the legalization process of collectives. All collectives were brought under, there was an attempt to bring them all under legal recognition of the state. This included a lot of bureaucratic work, and the CNT collectives that resisted this were then left out to dry and kind of unplugged from these regional networks of support that had naturally emerged. In March 1937, there was the banning of the control patrols, which were the makeshift kind of police support in charge of securing the rear guard during the Civil War, and a militarization of the militias. So the militias were also started to be structured in a formal military structure. So all the gains of the militias, including kind of democratic decision-making or the voluntary basis of them, was removed. In May 1937, there was the Barcelona May Days. This was a clash between the CNT and the communists, in which there was an attempt to take over the telephone exchange in the center of Barcelona, which was under the control of the CNT since the beginning of the revolution. It resulted in 500 dead and 1,000 wounded, and a lot more CNT members imprisoned by the Communist Party. Again, the CNT leadership rushed to argue for a ceasefire and that there should be no confrontation within the Popular Front forces. In August 1937, there was the beginning of the process of forced decollectivization, most notably in Aragon, which was a CNT stronghold, and here we have communist sections of the army forcibly breaking up the collectives. And finally, in August 1938, there was the militarization of the war industries. So essentially, the nationalization of all industries that were previously under workers' control. And war industries was given a very broad remit in terms of what it can cover. So included in this nationalization were things like public transport, even within cities, so that don't really have any war-related efforts. But all of this were methods to undermine the self-management of workers, the initiative they took. And the CNT essentially, or the leadership of the CNT essentially stood aside because they continued to see the plans of the government as their goal. Of course, that doesn't mean there weren't forms of resistance. During the May Days, the CNT did resist until the National Committee intervened. There were resistances to the militarization, most notably the Iron Column, which was one of the CNT's militia columns, refused to be rolled into the military until the very end, in which they themselves voted to accept militarization. But the idea is that even when there was these forms of resistance, they were so fragmented and isolated they couldn't really offer a way out or to ensure the protection of the revolution. But an important criticism did emerge from within the CNT, and this was from the Friends of Durruti group. And they argued that the CNT lacked an organism capable of repressing in an organized sense and with the utmost energy hostile sectors who are not identified with the working class. This was because the CNT had no theory and no idea as to which course of action to pursue following the coup. Now, I disagree with this critique on two accounts. Is one, that the CNT did have an organism capable of repressing enemies of the working class. And we know this because they actually did it in the collectives. So that body existed. It was rather that the CNT leadership was refusing to utilize this body to carry out the revolution to its logical conclusion. this raises the question that, well, how do you then balance the idea of workers' autonomy and self-emancipation with the need to suppress class enemies? I mean, at the end of the day, what the Friends of Durruti are suggesting is very close to the communist principle of a dictatorship of the proletariat, where class enemies, or you retain a section of the state to suppress class enemies. So it is a wholehearted kind of diversion from anarchist principles of self-autonomy and self-emancipation. Because, well, if you believe in autonomy and self-emancipation, then who gets to decide who is or isn't a class enemy? There's a conceptual clash there in how you carry out a revolution. And I don't have an answer to this question, that's why there's still a question mark there. But maybe we can discuss these in the at the end. Okay, we're at the last section, and yeah, I think we're still doing okay on time. So what role does the international situation play? No revolution is a wholeheartedly domestic affair, even though it is carried out by domestic actors. But it always takes place within an international context. So what did this international context at the time look like? You had the rise of fascist Italy in 1922, and then now Nazi Germany in 1933, the main allies to Franco's coup. You had the League of Nations, which was somewhat newly constituted following World War I. And this was seen to be as the arena in which international disputes were now meant to be settled to avoid more world wars. But then, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that one of the reasons that the CNT wanted to join the government is to maintain the sense of legitimacy in an international context and to secure arms from France and Britain. But France and Britain didn't really care about what was happening in Spain. They were a lot more fearful of being drawn into a confrontation with Germany, which they saw as a bulwark against communism. They were very happy with having a fascist Italy and a Nazi Germany, so long as they acted as a buffer zone from a communist East. And they were more concerned at maintaining that buffer than helping another fellow democratic country such as Spain. So not only did they not help the Republic, but they actually initiated a non-intervention agreement, which included 26 other countries. Now, although the non-intervention agreement meant to maintain a neutral stance towards the parties of the Civil War amongst those who signed it, what it effectively did is it left the Republic with no access to arms on the international market. And the other side, where you had Italy and Germany, were more than happy to supply Franco with weapons. Very soon, the US also launched its own embargo on weapon sales to Spain, leaving the Republic even more isolated. Now, the Republic didn't have its own weapons industrial base, or it was only starting to develop them, but they found a very close ally with Russia, or the USSR at that point. The Republic also wanted to maintain an image of legitimacy and recourse to the League of Nations to try and block Germany and Italy's involvement of the war, which was to no avail. Whereas the USSR's interest in Spain lay in its fear that Britain, France, and Nazi Germany may unite against it. So its involvement in Spain were based on four general hopes. The first, and they were happy with either of these taking place, and that's what encouraged them to really participate. The first is they wanted to see if they can draw out France and Britain from their isolation in the name of what they called collective security, so the security of the democratic or progressive countries of the world. Second, they wanted to see if maybe they can prolong the Civil War until it developed into a full-blown European war in which they would act as observers. So they thought if we could get the republics and the fascists fighting in Spain long enough, at some point it will eventually grow into a European war where they can sit out. Or they could use their support to wrangle political concessions from Germany later down the line, which is what they did after when they signed a peace accord, the Ribbentrop Molotov Pact, I think it was called, several years later. Finally, if they won the Civil War, well then this would allow it to control Spain and use it as leverage to influence French and British policy, which would be keen to maintain this access to the Mediterranean in a future war or just due to international trade. Both the Republic and the USSR's interests required the suppression and the subjugation of the collectives. For them to be able to present this image of them as a legitimate democratic state, they needed to suppress the collectives and get rid of workers' self-management. There is a lot of talk about Russia's help of the Republic, but I would argue, there are different positions on this, that it was less helpful than it was destructive to both the revolutionary process and winning the flat-out military struggle against fascism. There's a lot of talk about Russian aid, but what really this was limited to was military advisors and support for the Republic in international relations and in organizing an army of international volunteers who would fight on the side of the Republic, the famed International Brigades. The weapons provided by Russia, they were actually bought for in Spanish gold. Spain had the second largest gold reserves, and in one of the biggest scandals of the Civil War, the Minister of Finance of the Republic, who was a communist sympathizer, signed off without the knowledge of the rest of the government to get the entire gold reserves of Spain shipped to Moscow before they had received any weapons. So this meant that Spain lost any kind of financial leverage it had to negotiate better terms of trade with the USSR when it came to weaponry. But the weaponry that they did got, the few that they did get, was low in quality, it was difficult to maintain, and sometimes obsolete. The diversity of the weapons, furthermore, made it very difficult to source or manufacture ammunition and the industrial methods required to sustain a war. So in simple terms, you have 10 different guns with 10 different calibers, you need 10 different factories producing the different ammunition you need for those guns, as opposed to having standardized cartridges that would allow for economies of scale. Now, this is the direct relationship between the USSR and Spain, but within Spain as well, the Communist Party, which was virtually unheard of before the war, started to become more and more prominent due to this aid. The role that the PCE played, the Communist Party, was wholly reactionary. They propagandized against collectives by targeting small landholding peasants, barbers, bakers, carpenters, sandal makers, doctors, essentially what we'd call the petty bourgeois, advising them to join the party to secure protection from collectivization. It's worth noting that before the Civil War, this was traditionally the role of the right-wing parties, so the PCE came in, kind of filled in that role. And in one of the major ways in which the PCE gained control of the government apparatus itself was through the army. By 1938, a year before the loss of the Republic, the PCE had managed to capture between 80 and 90% of army command positions. And that is in large part due to the militarization strategy that the USSR had advised the Spanish Republic to take. So what are the results of the Republican policies and Russian interference? Because I do want to emphasize that although I'm talking a lot about Russian interference, this interference was facilitated by the Republicans' own policies. It's not that anything was entirely forced on the Republic, but there was this mutual relationship between the two. So morale suffered greatly as all the gains made by the workers since the rebellion and self-management were reversed, with workplace democracy substituted by military discipline. The Republic lost any chance of developing a war industry that could free it from dependence on the USSR or others. Militarization meant to create more efficient military fighting force failed as the Republic continued to lose battle after battle. Therefore, many volunteers who had joined and usually stayed with the militias, they left for the front and retreated to the rear guards where they would just rather be on the collectives carrying out tasks that they saw were worthwhile. And military campaigns that would have threatened the USSR's influence were abandoned. So, for example, the CNT, which was based on the Aragon front, never got the weapons they needed to launch an actual counter-assault against Franco's forces. And the strategy of guerrilla warfare was abandoned because the USSR saw that, well, we would have no influence on what would be happening behind enemy lines. So the question is, do international contexts or circumstances, do they determine the way that revolutions unfold, or are they also determined by revolutions themselves? And as I said, revolutions are intrinsically international. Even if you have a successful workers' revolution in one country, you still exist within a capitalist world system, and therefore there are international dimensions that need to be questioned or thought out. This does not mean that they are beyond control. There continues to be a role for international working class solidarity, and the CNT would have had this support had it not itself decided to join the government itself. Another important international component is that the CNT had opportunities to undermine fascist support by applying their principles of federalism to the Spanish colonies, which was the staging ground of the coup itself, especially in Morocco. But this was largely ignored by the CNT, so an important international aspect that could have turned the tide of war was completely ignored and not thought of by the CNT. So here I pose another question. Knowing that revolutions have international dimensions, how do we build our movements in a way that accounts for this? I will end it there, and if anyone is curious, so these are all the kind of sources I've drawn from.